Okay, so we are going to now be reading excerpts from Thomas Reid, and they come from the Essays on the Intellectual Powers of Man, and one of them is from Essay 3, Chapter 4, and the other is from Essay 3, Chapter 6. So when it gets very specific about Locke, it's Chapter 6. Of identity. The conviction which everyone has of their identity, as far back as their memory reaches, needs no aid of philosophy to strengthen it, and no philosophy can weaken it without first producing some degree of insanity. The philosopher, however, may very properly consider this conviction as a phenomenon of human nature worthy of attention. So the conviction that you really are the same person that you remember having been in the past. If the philosopher can discover its cause, an addition is made to the stock of knowledge. If not, it must be held as a part of our original constitution, or an effect of that constitution produced in a manner unknown to us. We may observe, first of all, that this conviction is indispensably necessary to all exercise of reason. The operations of reason, whether in action or in speculation, are made up of successive parts. The antecedent are the foundation of the consequent. So the earlier operations are the foundation for the later ones. And without the conviction that the antecedent had been seen or done by me, I could have no reason to proceed to the consequent in any speculation or in any active project whatsoever. So even reasoning that takes just a couple moments still requires that it was the same you that was there a couple moments ago. There can be no memory of what is past without the conviction that we existed at the time remembered. There may be good argument to convince me that I existed before the earliest thing I can remember, but to suppose that my memory reaches a moment farther back than my belief and conviction of my existence is a contradiction. So you can't remember things that aren't also part of the conviction that you exist. The moment someone loses this conviction, as if they had drunk the water of Lethe, past things are done away, and in their own belief, they then begin to exist. Whatever was thought or said or done or suffered before that period may belong to some other person, but they can never impute it to themselves or take any subsequent step that supposes it to be their doing. From this, it is evident that we must have the conviction of our own continued existence and identity as soon as we are capable of thinking or doing anything on account of what we have thought or done or suffered before. That is, as soon as we are reasonable creatures. That we may form as distinct a notion as we are able of this phenomenon of the human mind, it is proper to consider what is meant by identity in general, what by our own personal identity, and how we are led into that invincible belief and conviction which everyone has of their own personal identity as far as their memory reaches. So we're not just looking at personal identity, we're looking at the conviction that you are the same person, as well as personal identity. Identity in general, I take to be a relation between a thing which is known to exist at one time and a thing which is known to have existed at another time. So it has to be at two different moments. If you ask whether they are one and the same or two different things, everyone of common sense understands the meaning of your question perfectly. Whence we may infer with certainty that everyone of common sense has a clear and distinct notion of identity. If you ask a definition of identity, I confess I can give none. It is too simple a notion to admit of a logical definition. I can say it is a relation, but I cannot find words to express the specific difference between this and other relations, though I am in no danger of confounding it with any other. I can say that diversity is a contrary relation. So to say that two things are identical is to say that they're not diverse, so there's not more than one. And that similitude and dissimilitude are another couple of contrary relations. So similitude is being similar to, and dissimilitude is dissimilarity to, which everyone easily distinguishes in their conception from identity and diversity. I see evidently that identity supposes an uninterrupted continuance of existence. That which has ceased to exist cannot be the same with that which afterwards begins to exist. For this would be to suppose a being to exist after it ceased to exist and to have had existence before it was produced, which are manifest contradictions. Continued uninterrupted existence is therefore necessarily implied in identity. Hence we may infer that identity cannot, in its proper sense, be applied to our pains, our pleasures, our thoughts, or any operation of our minds. The pain felt this day is not the same individual pain which I felt yesterday, though they may be similar in kind and degree and have the same cause. The same may be said of every feeling and of every operation of mind. They are all successive in their nature, like time itself, no two moments of which can be the same moment. It is otherwise with the parts of absolute space. They always are and were and will be the same. So far, I think we proceed upon clear ground in fixing the notion of identity in general. So identity has something very special to do with time in a way that's different than space. It is perhaps more difficult to ascertain with precision the meaning of personality or personhood, but it is not necessary in the present subject. It is sufficient for our purpose to observe that all humankind place their personality in something that cannot be divided or consist of parts. Sometimes the philosophers also call this simple as opposed to compound. So it isn't the sort of thing where you can divide it and then here's this part of it and this part over there. It sort of has to hang together. A part of a person is a manifest absurdity. When someone loses their estate, their health, their strength, they're still the same person and have lost nothing of their personality or personhood. If they have a leg or an arm cut off, you're still the same person as before. The amputated member is no part of the person. Otherwise, it would have a right to a part of your estate. So if your hand gets chopped off, it's clearly not part of your person, or it should be allowed to inherit some of your stuff and be liable for part of his engagements. All right, it would be entitled to a share of the merit and demerit, which is manifestly absurd. A person is something indivisible and is what Leibniz calls a monad. My personal identity, therefore, implies the continued existence of that indivisible thing which I call myself. Whatever the self may be, it is something which thinks and deliberates and resolves and acts and suffers. I am not thought, I am not action, I am not feeling, I am something that thinks and acts and suffers. My thoughts and actions and feelings change every moment. They have no continued, but a successive existence. But the self or I to which they belong is permanent and has the same relation to all the succeeding thoughts, actions, and feelings, which I call mine. Such are the notions that I have of my personal identity. But perhaps it may be said that this may all be fancy without reality. How do you know, what evidence have you, that there is such a permanent self which has a claim to all the thoughts, actions, and feelings which you call yours? To this I answer that the proper evidence I have of all this is remembrance. I remember that 20 years ago I conversed with such a person. I remember several things that passed in that conversation. My memory testifies not only that this was done, but that it was done by me who now remember it. If it was done by me, I must have existed at that time and continue to exist from that time to the present. If the identical person whom I call myself had not a part in that conversation, my memory is fallacious. It gives a distinct and positive testimony of what is not true. Everyone in their senses believes what they distinctly remember, and everything they remember convinced them that they existed at the time remembered. So you don't remember it the way you remember like a scene in the book that you weren't there for. You remember your own actions as a thing that you did. Although memory gives the most irresistible evidence of my being the identical person that did such a thing at such a time, I may have other good evidence of things which befell me and which I do not remember. I know who bare me and suckled me, but I do not remember these events. It may be here observed, though the observation would have been unnecessary if some great philosophers had not contradicted it. Here he's throwing shade on Locke. That it is not my remembering any action of mine that makes me to be the person who did it. This remembrance makes me to know assuredly that I did it. But I might have done it, though I did not remember it. This relation to me, which is expressed by saying that I did it, would be the same, though I had not the least remembrance of it. So he's saying the remembrance of it isn't what makes it into your action, it's the evidence that you have that it was your action. So he's saying it's evidence, not the thing that makes it into your own self. To say that my remembering that I did such a thing, or as some choose to express it, my being conscious that I did it, makes me to have done it, appears to me oh yeah, so that I remember having done it makes me too have done it, appears to me as great an absurdity as it would be to say that my belief that the world was created made the world be created. When we pass judgment on the identity of other persons than ourselves, we proceed upon other grounds and determine from a variety of circumstances, which sometimes produce the firmest assurance and sometimes leave room for doubt. The identity of persons has often furnished matter of serious litigation before tribunals of justice, but no one of sound mind ever doubted of their own identity as far as they distinctly remembered. This is an important part. The identity of a person is a perfect identity. Whenever it is real, it admits of no degrees. You're either yourself or you're not. And it is impossible that a person should be in part the same and in part different, because a person is a monad and not divisible into parts. The evidence of identity in other persons than ourselves does indeed admit of all degrees. So you can be anywhere from more to less sure that it is the same other person. From what we account certainty to the least degree of probability. But still it is true that the same person is perfectly the same and cannot be so in part or in some degree only. So he's really distinguishing between what it is to be the same person, or the metaphysics of it, and what it is to know that this is the same person, or the epistemological aspects of it. We probably at first derive our notion of identity from that natural conviction which everyone has from the dawn of reason of their own identity and continued existence. The operations of our mind are all successive and have no continued existence. But the thinking being has a continued existence, and we have an invincible belief that it remains the same when all its thoughts and operations change. Our judgments of the identity of objects of sense seem to be formed much upon the same grounds as judgments of the identity of other persons than ourselves. So we judge whether or not it's the same coffee cup in ways that are much more similar to how we judge whether or not it's the same other person that we met. Whenever we observe great similarity, we are apt to presume identity, if no reason appears to the contrary. Two objects ever so like, when they are perceived at the same time, cannot be the same. But if they are presented to our senses at different times, we are apt to think them the same, merely from the similarity. Whether this is a natural prejudice, or from whatever cause it proceeds, it certainly appears in children from infancy. And when we grow up, it is confirmed in most instances by experience, for we rarely find two individuals of the same species that are not distinguishable by obvious differences. This is before they had like the Industrial Revolution and started mass producing stuff. A man challenges a thief whom he finds in possession of his horse or his watch, only on similarity. When the watchmaker swears that he sold this watch to such a person, his testimony is grounded on similarity. The testimony of witnesses to the identity of a person is commonly grounded on no other evidence. Thus, it appears that the evidence we have of our own identity, as far back as we remember it, is totally of a different kind from the evidence we have of the identity of other persons or of objects of sense. The first is grounded on memory and gives undoubted certainty. The last is grounded on similarity and on other circumstances, which in many cases are not so decisive as to leave no room for doubt. So here's a pen. And then, oh, is it the same pen, or do I just happen to have two of the same pen? This doesn't give us any grounded certainty, but my remembering starting this reading is me doing the reading, and that gives undoubted certainty. It may likewise be observed that the identity of objects of sense is never perfect. All bodies, as they consist of innumerable parts that may be disjoined from them by a great variety of causes, are subject to continual changes of their substance, increasing, diminishing, changing insensibly. When such alterations are gradual, because language could not afford a different name for every different state of such a changeable being, it retains the same name and is considered as the same thing. Thus we say of an old regiment that it did such a thing a century ago, though there is not now a person alive who then belonged to it. We say a tree is the same in the seedbed and in the forest. A ship of war, which has successively changed the anchors, the tackle, the sails, the masts, the planks, and the timbers, while it keeps the same name, is the same. The identity, therefore, which we ascribe to bodies, whether natural or artificial, is not perfect identity. It is rather something which, for the convenience of speech, we call identity. It admits of a great change of the subject, providing the change be gradual, sometimes even of a total change. And the changes which in common language are made consistent with identity differ from those that are thought to destroy it, not in kind, but in number and degree. It has no fixed nature when applied to bodies. So there's really no firm notion, he says, of identity when you're talking about bodies. And questions about the identity of a body are very often questions about words. But identity, when applied to persons, has no ambiguity and admits not of degrees or of more or less. It is the foundation of all rights and obligations and of all accountableness, and the notion of it is fixed and precise. All right, and now we're moving to the next excerpt of Mr. Locke's account of our personal identity. In a long chapter upon identity and diversity, Mr. Locke has made many ingenious and just observations, and some which I think cannot be defended. I shall only take notice of the account he gives of our own personal identity. His doctrine upon the subject has been censured by Bishop Butler in a short essay subjoined to his analogy, with whose sentiments I perfectly agree. Identity, as was observed, supposes the continued existence of the being of which it is affirmed, so it has to be the same being continuing, and therefore can be applied only to things which have a continued existence. While any being continues to exist, it is the same being, but two beings which have a different beginning or a different ending of their existence cannot possibly be the same. To this, I think, Mr. Locke agrees. He observes very justly that to know what is meant by the same person, we must consider what the word person stands for. And he defines a person to be an intelligent being endowed with reason and with consciousness, which last he thinks inseparable from thought. From this definition of a person, it must necessarily follow that while the intelligent being continues to exist and to be intelligent, it must be the same person. Excuse me. To say that the intelligent being is the same person, and yet that the person ceases to exist while the intelligent being continues, or that the person continues while the intelligent being ceases to exist, is to my apprehension a manifest contradiction. One would think that the definition of a person should perfectly ascertain the nature of personal identity, or wherein it consists, though it might still be a question how we come to know and be assured of our personal identity. So there's a different question in what does personal identity consist? That's the metaphysical question, from how do we come to know that any particular identity holds of a particular person. Mr. Locke tells us, however, that, quote, personal identity, that is, the sameness of a rational being, consists in consciousness alone, and as far as this consciousness can be extended backwards to any past action or thought, so far reaches the identity of that person. So that whatever has the consciousness of present and past actions is the same person to whom they belong. End quote. This doctrine has some strange consequences, which the author is aware of, such as that if the same consciousness can be transferred from one intelligent being to another, which he thinks we cannot show to be impossible, then 2 or 20 intelligent beings may be the same person. And if the intelligent being may lose the consciousness of the actions done by him, which surely is possible, then this is not the same person that did those actions. So that one intelligent being may be 2 or 20 different persons. So intelligent being and persons are coming apart more than Reid is comfortable with. If he shall so often lose the consciousness of his former actions. This is a really important part. There is another consequence of this doctrine, which follows no less necessarily, though Mr. Locke probably did not see it. It is that a person may be and at the same time not be the person that did a particular action. Essentially, he's going to show there's a contradiction. Suppose a brave officer to have been flogged when a boy at school for robbing an orchard, to have taken a standard from the enemy in his first campaign, and to have been made a general in his advanced life. Suppose also, which must be admitted to be possible, that when he took the standard, he was conscious of his having been flogged at school, and that when he was made general, he was conscious of having taken the standard, but had absolutely lost the consciousness of his flogging. So the old person forgot the thing that happened when he was a kid, but the young person hadn't forgotten it. But the old person remembers, the person in their 20s or something like this. These things being supposed, it follows from Mr. Locke's doctrine that he who was flogged at school is the same person who took the standard, and that he who took the standard is the same person who was made general. Whence it follows, if there be any truth in logic, that the general is the same person with him who was flogged at school. But the general's consciousness does not reach so far back as the flogging. Therefore, according to Mr. Locke's doctrine, he is not the person who was flogged. Therefore, the general is, and at the same time is not, the same person with him who was flogged at school. Leaving the consequences of this doctrine to those who have the leisure to trace them, we may observe with regard to the doctrine itself. First, that Mr. Locke attributes to consciousness the convictions we have of our past actions, as if a person may now be conscious of what they did 20 years ago. It is impossible to understand the meaning of this unless by consciousness be meant memory, the only faculty by which we have an immediate knowledge of our past actions. Sometimes in popular discourse, a person says they are conscious that they did such a thing, meaning that they distinctly remember that they did it. It is unnecessary in common discourse to fix accurately the limits between consciousness and memory. This was formerly shown to be the case with regard to sense and memory, and therefore distinct remembrance is sometimes called sense, sometimes consciousness without any inconvenience. But this ought to be avoided in philosophy. Otherwise, we confound the different powers of the mind and ascribe to one what really belongs to another. If a person can be conscious of what they did 20 years ago or 20 minutes ago, there is no use for memory. So he's trying to show that being conscious of something has a kind of immediacy right nowness to it, and that what you're actually doing is remembering, not being conscious. Nor ought we to allow that there is such a faculty. The faculties of consciousness and memory are chiefly distinguished by this, that the first, or consciousness, is an immediate knowledge of the present, and the second, or memory, an immediate knowledge of the past. I do want to flag that I think he's using the term consciousness differently than Locke was. When, therefore, Mr. Locke's notion of personal identity is properly expressed, it is that personal identity consists in distinct remembrance. For, even in the popular sense, to say that I am conscious of a past action means nothing else than that I distinctly remember that I did it. Secondly, it may be observed that in this doctrine, not only is consciousness confounded with memory, but, which is still more strange, personal identity is confounded with the evidence which we have of our personal identity. This is going to be an important point. It is very true that my remembrance that I did such a thing is the evidence I have that I am the identical person who did it. And this I am apt to think Mr. Locke meant. But to say that my remembrance that I did such a thing, or my consciousness, makes me the person who did it, is, in my apprehension, an absurdity too gross to be entertained by anyone who attends to the meaning of it. It's like, so he's throwing a lot of shade now on Locke, like clearly he didn't think this one through. 4, it is to attribute to memory or consciousness a strange magical power of producing its object. So if you have evidence to believe something, and then your belief in it somehow constitutes the thing that you're believing, namely that you're the same person, he thinks that you're mixing these two things up. Though that object must have existed before the memory or the consciousness produced it. Consciousness is the testimony of one faculty. Memory is the testimony of another faculty. And to say that the testimony is the cause of the thing to which it testifies, this surely is absurd, if anything could be, and could not have been said by Mr. Locke had he not confounded the testimony with the thing testified. When a horse that was stolen is found and claimed by the owner, the only evidence he can have, or that a judge and witnesses can have, that this is the very identical horse, which was his property, is similitude. Like, yes, I recognize this horse, it's very similar. But would it not be ridiculous from this to infer that the identity of a horse consists in similitude only? So that's the evidence, but that's not what the identity really consists in. The only evidence I have that I am the identical person who did such an action is that I remember distinctly that I did them. Or, as Mr. Locke expresses it, I am conscious that I did them. To infer from this that personal identity consists in consciousness is an argument which, if it has any force, would prove the identity of a stolen horse to consist solely in similitude. Third, is it not strange that the sameness or identity of a person should consist in a thing which is continually changing and which is not any 2 minutes the same? Our consciousness, our memory, and every operation of the mind are still flowing like the water of a river or like time itself. The consciousness I have this moment can no more be the same consciousness I had last moment than this moment can be the last moment. Identity can only be affirmed of things which have a continued existence. Consciousness and every kind of thought are transient and momentary and have no continued existence. And therefore, if personal identity consisted in consciousness, it would certainly follow that no one is the same person any 2 moments of their life. And as the right and justice of reward and punishment are founded on personal identity, no one can be responsible for their actions. But though I take this to be the unavoidable consequence of Mr. Locke's doctrine concerning personal identity, and though some persons may have liked the doctrine the better on this account, I am far from imputing anything of this kind to Mr. Locke. So now he's throwing shade on people who approved of this part of Locke, but surely Mr. Locke himself did not realize what he was saying. He was too good a man not to have rejected with abhorrence a doctrine which he believed to draw this consequence after it. Fourthly, there are many expressions used by Mr. Locke in speaking of personal identity, which to me are altogether unintelligible unless we suppose that he confounded the sameness or identity which we ascribe to an individual with the identity which in common discourse is often ascribed to many individuals of the same species. When we say that pain and pleasure, consciousness and memory are the same in all people, this sameness can only mean similarity or sameness of kind. That the pain of one person can be the same individual pain with that of another person is no less impossible, so it's impossible, than that one person should be another person. The pain felt by me yesterday can be no more the pain I feel today than yesterday can be this day. And the same thing can be said of every passion and of every operation of the mind. So if I'm feeling a pain and you're feeling the same kind of pain, it's not the actual same pain that we're feeling. We're feeling the same kind of pain, but there's two of them because you have one and I have the other. The same kind or species of operation may be in different people or in the same person at different times, but it is impossible that the same individual operation should be in different people or in the same person at different times. When Mr. Locke, therefore, speaks of the same consciousness being continued through a succession of different substances, when he speaks of repeating the idea of a past action with the same consciousness we had of it at the first, and of the same consciousness extending to actions past and to come, these expressions are to me unintelligible unless he means not the same individual consciousness, but a consciousness that is similar or of a similar kind, or of the same kind. If our personal identity consists in consciousness, as this consciousness cannot be the same individually any 2 moments, but only of the same kind, it would follow that we are not for any 2 moments the same individual persons, but only the same kind of persons. As our consciousness sometimes ceases to exist, as in sound sleep, our personal identity must cease with it. Mr. Locke allows that the same thing cannot have 2 beginnings of existence, so that our identity would be irrecoverably gone every time we cease to think, if it was but for a moment. All right, that's the end of this one.